So welcome back to our class here. Hi. We're going to talk about the next era of American history, known as the Gilded Age, and we're going to kind of define that term for you in just a moment. But before we do, you'll remember from the last chapter we talked about the Compromise of 1877, and what I've learned over my many years of teaching is that you very rarely remember the last thing that we talked about. And that's okay. So just real quick here, the Compromise of 1877 revolved around the very close, very disputed election of 1876, where the Democrats basically agreed that they would allow the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in exchange for basically the end of Reconstruction, for the end of federal troops being in the South. And it basically ended radical Reconstruction, and it granted the South their own sort of kind of home rule, like other regions of the country, right? They're not going to have to, have martial law and all these troops in the South enforcing rights and freeing slaves. And so these troops are going to leave, and now the rights of freed slaves are going to be subject to being mitigated by the Southern practices. So Hayes's withdrawal of federal troops finally ends in Louisiana and South Carolina, which are basically the last couple states that actually kind of end the troop withdrawal. It marks a really major turning point in political and social history. It effectively ended Reconstruction, allowed Southern states to issue the next system of laws, which would basically be called the Jim Crow laws. And freed slaves in those areas are not going to be granted the rights guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And obviously, you can go back and look at those amendments if you don't know what they are, but hopefully you know what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are. And it tells us, the compromise also tells us how we're going to kind of move forward in the Gilded Age, that sometimes compromises are very unofficial and very shady and under the table. This deal, the Compromise of 1877, was not exactly done with the best interest of slaves, right? Obviously. And so we're going to see that the Gilded Age is pretty corrupt, and it's an era known for both rapid economic growth, but also huge political corruption. And so let's kind of be very clear on the definition there. It's an era that occurred in the late 19th century, so from about 1870 to 1900, rapid economic growth, especially in the North and in the West. Western movies that you see on TV and stuff like that, like John Wayne, all of those movies are basically set in this time period, the 1860, 1870 to 1900s. That's the Wild West, right? It's a very interesting time period because the growth that happens in America actually kind of needed the corruption to take place. You had the bloodshed of the Civil War just 5 years before the Gilded Age starts. The population is still trying to grow, and during the Gilded Age, it leaps by bounds. Even though the Civil War killed 700,000-ish soldiers, right? The nation's population is up to 39 million by 1870, which is like 27% increase from the 1860s, even though the Civil War killed 700,000 people. So a lot of prosperity, a lot of growth. The population is really, really growing. Some of it is due to, birth. Some of it, but a lot of it is due to immigration. And immigration is a very contentious thing. People don't always like immigrants coming in. It's one of the themes of American history. It's kind of this back and forth between how we treat immigrants, because we still kind of wrestle with some of that today when we have so massive growth. Because we argue about whether that's good for social health or civic health. Well, on the heels of this very big population explosion, you kind of have to think of America like a prize fighter, right? The Civil War left us very bloody, bunches of bruises, a black eye or two, but we're suffering as a nation, but we also are going to try and push through and try and grow. We're still on our feet. We hadn't been knocked down, but we're going to try and grow. The problem is we don't have really great leaders during this time period. Hayes is not really a good president, right? And then you have Grant, and he's kind of a good enough as a general, not a good politician, pretty terrible president. And all of this is going to contribute to an era that's very interesting, and sometimes it's kind of hard to wrap our minds around when we get the notions of both immense progress and utter corruption. Now, the term gilded is the Gilded Age. It was coined by Mark Twain about 30 years after the era itself, but Mark Twain said it was a gilded age because it's not fully golden, right? Gilded means, if you don't know what gilded is, it's like if something is gilded, that's where you take something that's a lesser value, bronze or copper or even wood. You take a very thin sheet of gold and you hammer it on top of it. And so you smooth it out, it looks really nice, and when you look at it, you're like, wow, that looks like it's made out of solid gold. But it's not. It's gilded gold. It looks really expensive, but underneath, it's not really all that great. On the top, it looks like gold, but it's poop wrapped in gold. Okay? The Gilded Age is really, really kind of... is pretty worse. So the farther you dig into the history of the Gilded Age, the more you realize, yeah, everything wasn't as good as everybody said it was. Okay? Now, another term for this era is the era of good stealings. So you had the era of good feelings, and so this is the era of good stealings. Because corruption is rampant. Railroad promoters are going to promise and then not deliver on things. They're going to say, oh, we're going to build all these railroads. And then the government gives them a bunch of money, and they're like, we don't feel like building railroads. Pretty much. They're not going to deliver. They're not going to pay back the loans. Same thing with the stock market manipulators. They're going to do everything that they can to turn a quick profit. Very unregulated stock market at the time. And there's going to be long-term consequences. Because, economic maneuverings, they don't, they're not really standalone. They kind of go in waves. So one thing can affect another thing. Judges and legislatures during this time could essentially just be bribed and purchased for favors. Another landmark thing about the Gilded Age is the system of patronage, where you promise a bunch of voters, you say, hey, if you get all these people to vote for me, I'll give you a position in the government. I'll give you a position of influence, right? So maybe you own a factory and you get all your workers to vote for this politician, and in return, that politician will give you special favors once they're in office, right? There was a joke during the time that, you've heard about the man on the moon, right? Well, they say that every time the man on the moon passed over America, he had to hold his nose because it smelled so bad from corruption. So it's kind of like everybody knew it was going on, but nobody really did anything about it. Another joke was that an honest politician was one who would win and stay bought. Says a lot. During this era, we talk about other people, not just politicians. These are two gentlemen. This is Fisk and Gould, and these are some cheppy fellows. It's just another example. They're coming up on these guys. They concocted a scheme to corner the gold market in 1869. So just as the Gilded Age is just about to start, we're breaking it down. Their scheme basically comes about, and it requires the federal treasury to refrain from selling gold. Thus, they worked on a hapless greenhorn president, Ulysses S. Grant, to keep gold off the market by paying him $25,000 in cash. So they go to the President of the United States, and they're like, hey, it would be great if you didn't sell any of the gold that the United States Treasury has. He was like, well, won't that cause, problems? Don't people need there to be more gold out? And they're like, how about we give you $25,000? And the president was like, okay, I guess I'll just do that. Not supposed to do that. Well, basically, they get, in the same year, they bid the price of gold. They start buying it. And when you and the government's not putting more gold onto the market, and they're taking gold off the market, what's going to happen to the price of gold? It's going to go way up. So basically, they convinced the president to manipulate the price of gold for them to get rich. And it only cost them 25 grand. Made millions, okay? Yeah, they made millions. And it's just people, it's comically stupid. I mean, these guys end up getting put in prison because of what they did. And they lose everything. But just the idea that you can just walk up to the president and just, buy him. I mean, these guys must have thought they were Russians or Ukrainians or some Chinese people with our presidents or something like that. That's the level of corruption we're talking about. And so basically it's illegal, obviously. Now, there's another guy, everybody. Another person that we can talk about is this guy, Boss Tweed. He perfectly basically represents the ethics of the day. He's a crime boss in New York City. And through a combination of bribery and gifts and rigging elections, he basically milks New York for roughly $200 million in his day. He basically robs the state of New York, or New York City, for $200 million, which today would be several billion dollars. He becomes the most powerful man in New York for a time as a result, and the New York Times actually publishes a piece against him, which is pretty courageous of them. He's a crime boss, and they try to take him out. Eventually, Samuel J. Tilden, who's going to run for president later on, and he's part of that, the 1877 thing. Samuel Tilden successfully prosecutes him. He gets arrested, put behind bars, but the damage that Tweed had done was already there. He showed people that the system could be worked and that these underhanded ways, were really better than anything else. I mean, it was the real way to get rich, was to be corrupt, to steal it. And nobody was really going to do all that much. I mean, he got sent to jail and he dies behind bars, but he was very much still in charge of stuff, even behind bars. And he would work these under the table deals and kind of wiggle out of all the, trouble that was caused by it until he finally got just so outrageously courageous on how he was corrupt that he got caught. Another example involves a company, and actually there's three of them, but then we'll move on to the Native American question. But this scandal is called the Credit and Mobius scandal, where the Union Pacific Railroad insiders basically form a credit union, like a construction company credit union, and they hire themselves at inflated prices to build railroad lines, earning 300 to 350% dividends on, and they come up with this way to basically exorbitantly increase the price of building a railroad. And because they're a credit union, that Congress is basically giving them money to do this. And they're worried that, if Congress figures out that they're federally backed credit union, so the federal government's backing them, they're creating the railroad company to get a loan from their own credit union and then charging them way more than they have to. They're basically just stealing money from the government. Well, they're like, well, what if Congress finds out? And they're like, don't worry about it. We'll just buy Congress. They bought Congress. And then they were like, yeah, but Congress, what if somebody else is like, we'll buy the vice president too. So they bought many people of Congress and the vice president, key politicians, so that, and then how'd they buy them? They gave them stock in the company. They're like, hey, we're stealing money from the government. This company is making a lot of money because we're stealing it from the government. You want some stock? Because you can steal money too. And everybody was like, well, sure. I like money. So that was kind of yeah. Obviously, if you're invested in this company and then another railroad company comes up and is like, hey, we want some government money to build a railroad, you're probably going to be like, well, I'm already invested in a company building a railroad. Maybe I should make it hard on this company. So then you have super corruption, right? And so it's very, very shady. The Union Pacific insiders actually pay off the vice president, as we said, the Congress. They actually have conversations with the president himself. You saw Fisk and Gould paying off the president. You have Boss Tweed paying off the entire state of New York. Every policeman and every politician in New York makes billions of dollars in today's money. These are the kind of scandals happening during the Gilded Age. Okay? Now, just to give you a feel for what's going on in this era in terms of politicians and bribes there, another major problem was that Americans are facing is that the remaining Native Americans, and let's be honest, our track record in the treatment of Native Americans as a nation is pretty bad. The first thing during the Gilded Age that is attempted to do is what we call assimilation. So in 1871, Congress decides that they're no longer going to recognize Native American tribes as sovereign entities. So basically they're saying, you're not your own nation anymore. And so we don't have to negotiate with you. And what they want is to force Native Americans to deal with the government as individuals rather than as groups. Then you say, okay, then we're going to interact with the government mostly as individual. What's the big deal? Well, the natives at this time especially identified themselves in these tribal groups. And a humongous part of their identity was wrapped up in, being a member of the tribe. And so when you're stripping away this core part of that identity from them, this idea that you're no longer part of a tribe, you're just an individual, you've basically it'd be like me coming to you and being like, you're no longer an American citizen. Like, how much of what we are is the fact that we're Americans, right? Well, you're not an American citizen anymore. Not only legally are you not, but you don't even get to claim heritage. Like, though, that's not a real entity anymore. I basically said that it doesn't even exist anymore. And so it's really, now you're going to ask them to come as less powerful to you and deal with the federal government of the United States as an individual. Well, how do you think that's going to turn out? Very poorly. What their idea here is that they're saying, hey, but if you'll assimilate, if you'll become more American, then you can no longer be, a Comanche, but you can be an American, right? This, English Christian value system. And, so the Native Americans now find themselves living in a predominantly English-speaking Christian nation. The idea that they need to learn these things is not as bad as, say, like some things could be. I mean, they're not cutting their feet off and killing them anymore, but they are basically destroying their heritage. They add to the idea that they make them start going to Christian schools. They make them compulsory. They have no option but to learn this stuff. And they're compelled and forced to kind of assimilate. Now it becomes more problematic. Asking them to convert to Christianity and become more Americanized and be a part of the country, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, hey, maybe that's a good idea. When you start compelling people, when you start forcing them to, that's going to become a major problem. It's really a racist thing to do. Then a few years later, they enact something called the Dawes Severalty Act, and that's a really important one to kind of remember. It stated that Native Americans who agree to break with their tribes could apply for citizenship and be given a portion of the tribal's land as a homestead. So this is really, just to put the Gilded Age in a nutshell, it's so shady but clever. It's really terrible because they're saying, okay, well, if you will claim to no longer be a part of your tribe and you become a U.S. citizen, we'll give you 160 acres of your tribe's land just for you. So they're bribing them essentially to become U.S. citizens. It's very, very uncomfortable when you really think about how awful that is. Now, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and on the left side here, from left to right, you see the native culture's values that they've had for century and some cases millennia. And then they're going, no, you need to be more like this. This is your heritage. This is what we want you to look like. And they're trying to assimilate the natives into U.S. culture in part to avoid bloodshed, but to be fair, it's really so that they can have power over them. They're manipulated, promised land, and then left out in the darkness and in the cold because, honestly, even once they assimilated, they really weren't treated as part of society anyway. So it was really just a way to get them to, submit without violence. Because, the U.S. would have killed them. Don't get me wrong. They just didn't want to. The result of this policy, it fails. But first, be clear that it fails. It takes until 1933, this idea of assimilation, to where President Roosevelt reverses the whole thing. He says, forget it, we're not doing this anymore. He returns autonomy to the tribes. But we still have issues with tribal citizenship and sovereignty today, right? We try to build pipelines through native land, and the U.S. government will come in and be like, hey, I know that this is your land and you're sovereign, but we got to get this oil from here to there, and there's a mountain over there, and it'd be easier if you just gave us that land back so we could put this pipeline. And then most of the time, the tribes are just like, no, we're not going to do it, and then we just do it anyway. So it really hasn't got much better. But yeah, they definitely still kind of exist today. Now, there's a lot of Native Americans that are very patriotic to America today. Lots of them. And so America continues to grow and strive and thrive and grow, but we try and sweep some of these things under the rug and try and pretend like, oh no, our issues with the natives are over, but they weren't over, and they're still not over. So brings us to the last two topics here. The first is the Panic of 1873. What happened was overreaching promoters, people trying to make a quick buck, build too many railroads. They undertake too many mining expeditions and so on, and the banks hand out these loans without people really doing the right amount of homework on whether the business idea is going to succeed or not. You have this population explosion. Everybody thinks, oh, I can do this, and I can do that, and I can invest in this, and I can build me one of these. And I think, they think, oh, there's all this money that's going to support us after the Civil War because this new banking system is growing, and it seems like it's on solid ground, and then it's not. All of a sudden, it's boom. Now there's not enough money, and nobody's paying back their loans, and all the businesses are failing, and they're like, money, we need it. And it's probably this one, of all the banking crises, this one's probably the one that, started, was probably the worst. It started with a problem in Europe when the stock market crashed there. Their investors start to sell off investments that they had made in American projects, particularly railroads, which is kind of a focus for quiz purposes. Also, the railroads back in those days are a relatively new invention, right? And they'd been borrowing money to get the cash to build these rail lines. And once the lines are completed, everybody's like, oh, we're going to ship their goods and travel from coast to coast, and it's supposed to be big business. And so they're borrowing all of this money, and they go into debt, and then the railroads don't make as much money as they think. And all the Europeans are selling what they had invested in it. And so these bonds the market is flooded with these bonds, and nobody wants to buy them, and nobody has any more cash, and the railroads go bankrupt, and now you've got this big giant problem. It's basically the house of cards tumble down. The stock market crashes, and panic spreads from New York to Washington, D.C., from Pennsylvania to Virginia, and then finally in the South, like Georgia, and in Indiana and Illinois and Ohio, and hundreds of banks fail during this 1 year. And over $7 million were lost just by African Americans in the South, which was probably the hardest hit group, because you have a group that had just, 8 years before just gained their freedom. They finally start building up some money, and then the banks that they put their money in all close, and they lose everything. So that kind of sucks. The consequence of that is, they slow down growth potentials, and they try and have a more reliable, stable base. But eventually, it doesn't take long before we get to the Great Depression, and we realize it was no bueno. The last thing here, indirect construct of Reconstruction was class warfare. We have work stoppages all over America as the lower classes demand better pay and better rights. From St. Louis to Baltimore, they use railroad strikes and factory strikes. In fact, the four largest railroad companies cut wages by 10%. And you get lots of railroad strikes where railroads aren't being finished. And so the federal government's like, well, we're too invested in this and we're really corrupt. So they send in the military to break these strikes, tell people to get back to work. They kill like several hundred people. Imagine someone going on strike today and then the military coming in and literally shooting them for not going to work. Like, that'd be crazy. You also have racial and ethnic conflict throughout the West Coast, especially with the Chinese and the Irish, because the Irish and the Chinese, they want the same jobs. And they end up having a lot of violence where the Irish are led by a man named Dennis Kearney. And it ends up being a very violent incident where they go and they really like, this is kind of crazy here, they're just punching Chinese people. What? They are. Look, this Irishman is just holding a sign and punching a Chinese fella. Ultimately, they end up passing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which, because of the conflict between Irish and Chinese, and basically it said no more immigrants from China are allowed in the U.S. And that lasts all the way until 1943. So again, this idea that, of a prize fighter, America is like, we're standing, but we're wobbling, right? But we've really got some bad things going on there. The Chinese Exclusion Act is terrible. And so the way they're being treated, along with the way that African Americans and freed slaves, now the Native Americans and the Chinese, the workers, all of these lower class people are going to end up being very, very prominent in some of the changes that are going to come out of the Gilded Age. And it's a very messy time, and they're also juggling corruption and all of these other things. So it's not a good situation.